20. The Alpha King mocked her to his lords. By sunrise she vanished. I heard my fated mate mocking. The heavy oak doors of the great hall did not quite meet their iron frames. A sliver of warm, honeyed light spilled onto the freezing stones of the corridor, cutting through the suffocating gloom of Vaughan Fortress. Outside the thick granite walls, the Frostwood blizzard howled, battering the high windows with a relentless assault of ice and wind. It was late on the eve of the winter solstice. The castle should have been asleep. Instead, the political machinery of the northern pack ground on behind closed doors. Fiona Mercer stood perfectly still in that narrow slice of light. The lowland healer wore a simple, worn wool tunic that offered little protection against the brutal drafts of the keep. The cold seeped through the thin soles of her slippers, numbing her toes, but she barely registered the discomfort. Her attention was entirely focused on the object cradled gently in her palm. It was a small glass vial of winter cherry oil. The container was still warm to the touch, retaining the heat of the small hearth fire she had maintained for the past 3 hours. Alistair had been coughing. It was a dry, rattling sound that he tried to hide behind a raised fist during the morning audiences, a remnant of a border patrol gone wrong in the freezing rain. No one else had seemed to notice, or perhaps the courtiers were simply too intimidated by the Alpha King to comment on his physical frailty. Fiona had noticed. She noticed most things in the keep quietly, without moving her face, because the elite were always too busy watching each other to bother watching a lowland outsider. She had spent the entire evening in the damp kitchens, crushing the dried cherries in a heavy stone mortar. It was exhausting, repetitive labor. After extracting the rare oil, she had heated it over low embers, folding in exactly enough pine resin to soothe a torn throat without causing the deep drowsiness that came from heavier medicines. It was a precise, meticulous process. It required absolute patience, measuring out the drops while the rest of the pack dined on roasted meat above her head. Now, staring down at the warm glass, the young woman watched her own breath condense against the smooth surface. The tiny fog of moisture bloomed and faded with her slow, even exhalations. She had spent her entire night preparing a remedy for a man who was currently holding court without her. She took a quiet step forward, intending to knock on the heavy timber. Her knuckles hovered just inches from the wood. Before her hand could make contact, the sharp, arrogant timbre of Hector Thorne carried down the hall. The Northern Duke had arrived 3 days prior, bringing with him a massive retinue, 50 armored guards, and a dangerous amount of political leverage. He controlled the winter grain supply for the entire territory. Without his heavy iron-bound carts navigating the frozen passes, the outer villages of Vaughan Fortress would inevitably starve before the spring thaw. He wielded that agricultural monopoly like a broad sword, demanding endless concessions from the crown. Fiona lowered her hand. She did not lean against the door to listen, knowing that would leave a shadow across the gap. She simply stood in the freezing draught, her posture straight, her grip on the vial steady, and listened to the politics of her own displacement. "We hear troubling whispers from the lower courts, Your Majesty," Hector drawled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The dull thud of a heavy goblet being set down punctuated his sentence. "They speak of a fated mate, a sudden, rather inconvenient alignment with a girl from the southern valleys. You must understand our hesitation to release the grain reserves if the throne is to be shared with a penniless herb picker." Fiona did not blink. The glass vial remained warm in her hand, a stark contrast to the sudden drop in temperature in her chest. She waited for the deep, measured voice of her mate. She expected the sovereign to shut down the insubordination with the quiet, terrifying authority he usually commanded. When Alistair Craig spoke, however, the tone was entirely wrong. Alistair's voice was rich, carrying effortlessly through the crack in the door, but it was laced with a cruel, dismissive amusement she had never heard before. "You northern lords listen to too many servant tales over your ale. The girl is a minor distraction. Nothing more. The corridor was silent, except for the howling wind outside, but inside the hall, a ripple of low laughter circled the massive oaked table. A distraction? Hector pressed, though the underlying threat in his tone had eased into smug satisfaction. The elders claim she wears the silver mark. They say she has laid absolute claim to your attention. My attention is currently focused on surviving this winter. Hector, not entertaining lowland superstitions, the king replied. His words were smooth, frictionless, and completely devastating. And then he did something worse. Alistair shifted his cadence, slightly softening his vowels, performing a flawless, mocking mimicry of Fiona's own regional accent. She makes a passable tea, I will grant her that. But to suggest I would bind the Northern Territories to a woman who counts copper coins and smells of crushed leaves. Please. By spring, she will be sent back to whatever mud-rutted village she crawled out of. The lords erupted into genuine, booming laughter. The sound hit the heavy oak doors like physical blows. Fiona stood motionless in the sliver of light. She recognized the strategy instantly. It was a tactical deception, a calculated performance designed to disarm the hostile dukes. By trivializing her existence, Alistair was shielding her from their immediate, deadly scrutiny. He was feeding their prejudice to secure the grain supply. It was a mathematically perfect political maneuver. She looked down at the vial of winter cherry oil. It was no longer warm. The draught from the freezing stones had bled the heat away, leaving the glass cold and hard against her skin. Inside the hall, the men continued to laugh, toasting to the king's pragmatism and the eventual departure of his temporary nuisance. Fiona did not drop the medicine. She did not gasp, nor did she push open the doors to demand an explanation. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Instead, she simply absorbed the reality of her position. The man who had whispered promises of safety in the dark had just publicly erased her worth to keep his crown secure. Further down the hall, the low scrape of a heavy boot against flagstone broke the quiet. Elowen Glynn emerged from the narrow spiral stairwell leading to the lower archives. The old keeper carried a stack of fresh parchment and a small block of dry ink, her hands permanently stained black at the knuckles. She smelled faintly of beeswax, old dust, and damp stone. Elowen paused, her sharp grey eyes taking in the geometry of the scene. The archivist heard the boisterous northern voices beyond the wood, saw the lowland healer standing motionless in the shadows, and understood the exact shape of the cruelty unfolding. Elowen offered no pity. Pity was a useless currency in Vaughan Fortress. Instead, the older woman gave a single, brief nod of deadpan realism, acknowledging a truth they both knew. The powerful rarely recognized the foundation holding up their walls until it crumbled beneath their own weight. Fiona returned the nod, her expression unreadable. She looked down at the vial of winter cherry oil resting in her palm. The custom-brewed fever tonic was still warm, the thick liquid catching the flicker of a nearby torch. It smelled sharply of resin and crushed bark, a precise medicine meant to clear a king's congested lungs. She had spent hours grinding the herbs, carefully measuring the dosage, working the mortar and pestle until her wrists ached with the effort. She stepped toward the deep recess of the corridor window. The sill was carved from rough-hewn granite, coated in a thin layer of evening frost that had seeped through the leaded glass. Slowly, deliberately, the young woman lowered her hand. She set the glass container onto the freezing stone. The surface was uneven. The rounded base of the medicine clicked lightly against a raised edge of mortar. Fiona paused. She did not leave it tilted. With careful, steady fingers, she gently adjusted the small bottle on the stone sill so it did not wobble, rotating the glass until it sat perfectly flush and stable. It was an act of absolute precision, ensuring her final gesture of care remained perfectly intact and dignified. Let the lords have their temporary distraction. Her duty as a healer was fulfilled, and her ledger was clean. She withdrew her hand. The glass cooled instantly against the frost. Without a single glance back at the council doors, she turned her back on the hall. In this fortress, silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. The walk back to the guest wing was a study in measured geometry. Fiona counted her steps, letting the rhythmic echo of her soft-soled shoes anchor her mind against the dropping temperature. The eastern corridors were notoriously draughty, the high Gothic windows rattling in their iron frames as the blizzard outside began to howl in earnest. By the time she reached her assigned chamber, the fire in the grand hearth had burned down to a pile of dull red embers, offering barely any warmth against the creeping chill of the stone floor. She closed a heavy door behind her, sliding the iron bolt into place with a quiet, definitive scrape. The room was expansive, draped in velvet, and filled with the kind of imposing northern luxury that had always felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Underneath the massive mahogany bed sat a single, battered leather trunk. She knelt on the woven rug, pulled her luggage out, and popped the oxidized brass latches. Moving toward the towering wardrobe, she opened the double doors. Inside hung 3 silk gowns provided by the castle, gifts meant to elevate her status in the eyes of the court. The fabric was stiff, threaded with silver wire and heavy pearls, designed for presentation rather than survival in the brutal climate. Fiona reached out, her calloused fingertips brushing against the elaborate embroidery of a dark blue bodice. She ran her fingers along the raised silver thread of the royal silks, comparing their heavy, useless luxury to the coarse but practical warmth of her own worn wool traveller's tunic resting on the shelf above. The silk was cold, rigid, demanding perfect posture and restricted breathing. Her wool garment, softened by years of hard wear in the lowlands, smelled faintly of pine needles, dried comfrey, and wood smoke. It was clothing built for movement, for treating the sick, for surviving a winter night, without the protection of a high wall. She did not tear the gowns from their hangers. She did not throw them to the floor in a fit of betrayal. Instead, the healer methodically unhooked the first dress, carried it to the unmade bed, and began to fold it. She matched the seams perfectly, smoothing out the fabric until the creases lay flat against the mattress. She repeated the process with the second and the third, stacking the expensive garments in a neat, orderly pile on the edge of the velvet blanket. It was a grounding ritual, a systematic erasure of her presence from a space that had never truly belonged to her. With the castle's finery discarded, she turned her attention to her own supplies. Into the leather trunk went the heavy tunic, a pair of sturdy riding boots, a wrapped bundle of dried herbs, and her leather-bound medical ledger. She packed with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew exactly how many items were required to stay alive in the Frostwood. The brass latches clicked shut. The room was exactly as she had found it upon her arrival, cold, immaculate, and utterly cleared of her identity. Alistair's private study smelled of beeswax candles and old vellum. Fiona closed the heavy oak door behind her, sealing off the draught from the corridor. She did not bring a lamp. The moonlight cutting across the polished ironwood desk provided enough illumination for what she needed to do. The silence in the room was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She stood perfectly still in the center of the rug, letting her breathing settle into a slow, measured rhythm. Her hands reached up to the crown of her head, finding the intricate braids she had woven that morning. Woven into the dark strands was the mate ribbon, an ancestral piece of heavy silk embroidered with oxidized silver thread. It was supposed to be a permanent fixture, a public declaration of a bond recognized by the old laws of the sovereign court. Most women, upon discovering a betrayal of that magnitude, would have torn the fabric from their hair, letting the strands rip in a fit of violent grief. Fiona did no such thing. Her fingers bypassed the knot and instead reached into the small leather pouch at her belt, retrieving a pair of sharp steel sewing shears. The metal felt freezing against her skin. She gripped the cold handles and brought the blades up to the side of her head. With precise, surgical movements, she located the tiny structural threads holding the silver-embroidered silk to her braid. Snip. The sound was sharp in the quiet study. She felt the slight loosening of the tension against her scalp. She moved her fingers a fraction of an inch lower, finding the next anchor point. Snip. She worked methodically, dismantling the physical manifestation of the fated connection without a single tremor in her hands. The shears sliced through the binding twine, not the ancestral silk. She refused to damage the artifact. It was a legal marker, a contract made of thread, and breaking it required administrative clarity, not emotional chaos. When the final knot gave way, the heavy ribbon slid free, resting in her open palm. The silver embroidery caught the moonlight, gleaming like a polished ledger line. Fiona stepped forward and laid the mate ribbon flat across the center of Alistair's desk. She smoothed the edges down with her thumb, aligning it perfectly parallel to his stack of northern border maps. It sat exactly where his eyes would fall the moment he sat down to work. She left no note. Parchment held its shape longer than promises in the bitter northern wind, and the unblemished, carefully removed ribbon was an undeniable document of its own. It stated clearly that she had not fled in a hysterical panic. She had dismantled her place in his life with absolute intention. She turned her back on the ironwood desk and walked out of the study, the shears already tucked securely away. Before the sun could breach the eastern battlements, the courtyard of Vaughan Fortress was plunged into its deepest, coldest hour. The temperature dropped so sharply that the stones seemed to exhale a thin, freezing mist. Fiona moved through the lower bailey, her worn wool traveller's tunic blending into the pre-dawn gloom. Her satchel rested heavily against her hip, secured tightly to prevent any metal buckles from clinking against her leather belt. She reached the perimeter of the inner wall, pausing behind a stack of empty grain barrels. The shadow paths of the keep were familiar to her. She had spent weeks observing how the structural arches cast long, intersecting wedges of darkness long before the morning watch changed. Near the southern postern gate, the stable guard, Brannock Kelly, leaned heavily against a wooden support beam. The man was bundled in thick furs, his halberd resting loosely in the crook of his arm. His chin had sunk to his chest, and a slow, rumbling snore escaped his lips, producing small clouds of white vapor in the freezing air. Brannock was a loyal sentry, but the sheer bone-chilling cold of the late-night watch often pushed the outer guards into a temporary drowsy hibernation. Fiona did not rush. She crouched in the shadow of the barrels, listening to the cadence of the guard's breathing. Inhale, a slight rattle in the chest. Exhale with a low, whistling snore. She waited for 3 complete cycles to ensure the rhythm was steady. On the 4th exhale, she stepped out from behind the wood. She placed her boots exactly where the cobblestones were covered by a thin layer of packed snow, avoiding the bare ice that would crunch under her weight. Step. Pause. Inhale. Brannock shifted slightly, his heavy boots scraping against the frozen ground. Fiona froze instantly, pressing her back against the rough stone of the guardhouse wall. The frozen mortar scraped against her palms like jagged glass as she flattened her hands against the masonry. She held her breath, staring at the frost-covered iron ring of the postern gate 10 yards away. The guard grunted, rubbed his gloved hand over his face, and settled back against the beam. The rhythmic snoring resumed. Fiona released her breath in a slow, controlled stream. She moved forward again, timing her final steps with his deep exhalations. She reached the postern door. The hinges had been oiled 2 days prior. She knew this because she had seen the quartermaster reviewing the maintenance ledger. She pressed the iron latch down with a steady, continuous pressure, ensuring the metal did not snap back. The door eased open just enough for her shoulders to pass through. The freezing wind of the Frostwood immediately lashed at her face, carrying the sharp metallic scent of impending snow. Fiona slipped through the gap. She pulled, The heavy wooden door shut behind her, easing the latch back into its cradle with the same mechanical precision. The locking mechanism clicked softly, a sound instantly swallowed by the howling wind outside the walls. She adjusted the strap of her satchel, turned her face toward the treacherous tree line, and vanished into the blizzard back at the towering fortress. Dawn arrived at Vaughan Fortress, not with warmth, but with a creeping iron-grey light that bled across the frozen stone. Alistair Craig walked the long corridor toward the southern wing, his footsteps unnaturally quiet against the heavy floorboards. He had spent the entire night in the council room, navigating the treacherous demands of Hector and the Northern Dukes. He had played their game. He had spoken the cruel words required to keep them from viewing his mate as a political target. Now he intended to explain the harsh architecture of his deception. He expected anger. He expected to spend the morning dismantling the hurt he had caused, negotiating their boundaries the way he negotiated treaties. He reached the heavy oak door of her chamber and pushed it open. The immediate drop in temperature hit him before his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was freezing. There was no fire in the hearth, not even the faint orange glow of dying embers. The air smelled only of cold ash, old wood, and bitter frost. Alistair stood in the threshold, waiting for the rustle of fabric, the shift of a blanket, or the quiet sound of her breath. There was nothing. The stillness of the room felt profoundly empty, carrying the particular kind of silence that swallows sound whole. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the sparse furnishings. The bed was perfectly made, the heavy wool blankets tucked with military precision. On the corner chair, the silk gowns provided by the castle administration were neatly folded, stacked with a meticulous care that felt like a final, unarguable statement. She had taken nothing that did not belong to her. Her single travel trunk was missing from the foot of the bed. Then he saw the desk. Resting perfectly flat in the center of the dark mahogany surface was the ancestral mate ribbon. The silver embroidery caught a sliver of the grey morning light, gleaming against the cold wood. Alistair stopped breathing. He moved toward the desk, the reality of her absence settling into him like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack of his engineered confidence. He reached out and picked up the ribbon. The fabric was ice-cold against his calloused fingers. He brought it closer, instinctively seeking the familiar comfort of her presence. The faint, sweet scent of mint and pine still lingered in the threads, but it was incredibly fragile. Even as he held it, he could feel the scent fading, devoured by the harsh winter draft leaking through the window panes. She had not stayed to argue or demand an explanation for his public mockery. She had not waited for him to define her worth in front of his court. She had packed her meager belongings, left the physical proof of their bond behind, and walked out into the dark. The elaborate political shield he had constructed to protect her had become the very weapon that drove her away. Alistair turned and walked out of the chamber, the mate ribbon gripped so tightly in his fist that his knuckles turned white. He did not summon the beta or the council advisors. He moved through the keep's winding corridors with the single-minded focus of a predator, stripped of its cage, ignoring the startled bows of the early morning kitchen staff and the flickering tallow candles lining the walls. He reached the outer courtyard just as the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. The bitter northern wind howled over the stone battlements, cutting straight through his linen shirt. Near the main portcullis, a lone figure stood huddled over a smoking iron brazier. Brannock Kelly, the stable guard on the final night watch, looked up from his freezing hands. The tired man straightened immediately at the sight of the Alpha King striding toward him without a cloak. "Who opened the gates?" Alistair asked. His voice was low, devoid of its usual measured diplomatic cadence. It was a raw physical demand. Brannock swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the heavy iron bars of the portcullis. "Sire, the gates were left cracked for the early grain carts. Just before the deepest freeze hit, I saw someone leave. When? Hours ago, Brannock stammered, his breath turning to white mist in the freezing air. He rubbed his thick leather gloves together, piecing together the fragmented memory of the Dark Watch. Before the shift change, I thought it was a scullery maid going out to check the root cellars. She was just wearing a worn wool traveller's tunic. She didn't carry a lantern. She moved so quietly, I almost didn't hear her boots on the snow. Alistair stared past the guard, looking out into the dense, swirling white void of the Frostwood. The temperature was dropping by the minute. The snow was already piling against the stone walls in heavy drifts, burying all evidence of passage. She went toward the tree line. Brannock added, his voice trembling slightly as he pointed a thick, gloved finger toward the heavy frost gathering on the courtyard gates. The metal was completely encased in jagged white ice. My king, the storm broke an hour ago. The outer paths are buried. No lowland healer can survive the Frostwood's early winter squall. Not in wool, not alone. The guard's practical realism hung in the freezing air, heavier than a formal decree. Brannock only knew the brutal mathematics of the northern winter. Flesh and blood froze in the Frostwood. That was an undeniable fact. Alistair looked down at the silver ribbon still crushed in his hand. He had tried to protect Fiona by diminishing her in front of Hector. Instead, he had sent her walking straight into the jaws of a blizzard, armed with nothing but the quiet dignity he had tried to strip away. The political sovereignty he held over the keep suddenly meant absolutely nothing. A crown could not generate heat. A title could not shield a woman from the snow. The wind screamed against the iron gates, rattling the heavy chains. Alistair did not return to the warmth of the fortress. He simply stood in the snow, calibrating the time he had lost, before the panic fully took root in his chest. The heavy oak doors of the armory shuddered as Alistair shoved them open, his shoulders breaking the resistance of the rusted iron hinges. Behind him, the panicked footsteps of the royal guard echoed against the frozen flagstones. They scrambled to form a search party, shouting orders to saddle horses. Alistair did not slow his stride. He raised one hand, cutting through the chaotic noise of the garrison with a single, sharp gesture. He would not allow a clumsy, heavily armored battalion to trample through the snow, blundering into the Frostwood and terrifying the very woman he needed to reach. "Call them off," Alistair commanded, his voice low but carrying the absolute weight of sovereign authority. He unclasped the heavy ceremonial chain of state from his neck, letting the gold medallion fall onto a wooden table with a dull clatter. Before the guard captain could obey, the towering figure of Hector Thorne stepped into the corridor, blocking the archway to the courtyard. The northern duke's face was ruddy with indignation, his thick fur-lined cloak sweeping the floor. Hector had spent the night drinking victory wine, believing his political maneuvering had successfully isolated the king from Fiona. Now, seeing Alistair preparing to leave the keep unguarded, the duke's arrogant composure cracked into genuine alarm. "You cannot be serious," Hector snapped, his voice sharp with disbelief. He signaled his advisors to close ranks behind him, forming a physical barricade of velvet and steel. "The winter grain negotiations are at their absolute apex, Your Grace. The southern passes are blocked. If you abandon the fortress now to chase after some fleeting lowland distraction, you leave the entire court vulnerable to the border clans. You are the Alpha King. You do not leave your throne empty for a minor servant." Alistair stopped. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop by several degrees. He did not growl, nor did he raise his voice to match the duke's frantic volume. Instead, he closed the distance between them with slow, terrifying precision. The king's dark eyes locked onto Hector's, stripping away the duke's inherited superiority in a matter of seconds. "She is not a distraction," Alistair said, the words slipping out as cold and hard as the frost clinging to the window panes. "She is the only reason this keep has a future. It is political suicide." Hector insisted, though he took a half-step backward as Alistair continued to advance. "You are risking a crown for a woman who could not even stomach a single banquet." Alistair did not argue the politics. He simply reached out, his hand clamping onto the shoulder of Hector's advisor, and physically shoved the man aside with a burst of effortless, unyielding force. The barricade of men scattered, their boots scraping frantically against the stone to avoid the king's wrath. "A crown is a hollow piece of metal," Alistair stated, his gaze fixed purely on the open courtyard ahead. "It is completely worthless if the foundation of my house has walked out the gate." He did not look back at the sputtered protests of the Northern Lord. He simply walked out into the freezing dawn, leaving the suffocating politics of the Great Hall behind him. The biting wind of the outer courtyard struck Alistair the moment he crossed the threshold, driving sharp needles of ice into his face. The blizzard had not broken with the sunrise. It had only intensified, painting the world in violent shades of grey. The snow was already knee-deep against the stone walls, burying the tracks of the merchant carts. Somewhere out there, alone in the brutal expanse of the Frostwood, was Fiona wearing only a worn traveller's tunic, carrying nothing but her own quiet dignity. Alistair did not hesitate. He shrugged off his heavy velvet cloak, letting the expensive fabric drop into the rising snowdrift. The cold was a physical blow against his skin, nothing compared to the sharp panic lodged behind his ribs. He dropped to one knee on the frozen earth, surrendering his human constraints to the desperate necessity of the hunt. The transition was violent and immediate. Bones cracked and reformed in a rapid, fluid rhythm, muscles expanding and thickening beneath a coat of midnight black fur. Where a king had knelt, massive dark wolf now stood, his paws sinking deeply into the freezing powder. Alistair shook the ice from his snout and lowered his head, pulling the frigid air past his teeth. Tracking in this weather was an exercise in sensory torment. The wind whipped across the courtyard, bringing with it a chaotic flood of overwhelming odors. He was bombarded by the acrid stench of burning coal from the keep's furnaces, the tang of wet iron, and the thick smell of wood smoke trapped beneath the cloud cover. He closed his eyes against the stinging ice, forcing his mind to filter out the heavy, industrial rot of the castle. He pushed past the scent of the stables, past the lingering grease of the banquet hall, digging into the very bottom of the air currents. He needed the delicate, almost imperceptible trace of lowland herbs. There, buried beneath the heavy smell of wet pine needles and frozen earth, was a faint, clean ribbon of scent, dried mint, crushed winter cherry, the quiet, methodical smell of Fiona's hands. It was desperately faint, already being swallowed by the heavy snowfall, but it was enough. Alistair opened his eyes, his golden irises cutting through the grey gloom. He lunged forward, his powerful hind legs driving him into the deep drifts. The physical toll of the storm was immediate. The icy wind battered his eyes, blinding him to the landscape, while the snow packed heavily into the thick fur of his chest and legs, dragging at his momentum like lead weights. He did not possess some magical, effortless glide over the snow. Every bounding step required immense exertion. His lungs burned with the frigid air, his paws growing numb against the frozen gravel. Yet he pushed harder, letting the punishing environment ground him. The pain of the biting wind was a necessary penance. He had built his political strategy on a foundation of deception, trading her safety for his court's stability, and now he was paying the physical price. The scent of mint drifted toward the jagged tree line of the Frostwood. Alistair lowered his head against the gale and followed, abandoning the warmth of his sovereign throne for the brutal truth of the winter mountains. The wind howling through the upper ridge of the Frostwood carried no warmth, only the biting sting of ice crystals tearing at the king's dark fur. He moved as a massive shadow against the blinding white terrain, his wolf form pushing relentlessly through drifts that reached his chest. The scent he sought, the faint, clean notes of crushed mint and winter pine, was already fragile, thinning rapidly with every violent gust sweeping down from the jagged peaks. He kept his heavy snout low, analyzing the microscopic shifts in the snow crust where a worn boot might have broken the fragile surface hours ago. The wilderness occupied silence the way other entities occupied space, vast, heavy, and utterly indifferent to the authority he wielded within the stone walls of his keep. Then, the geography shifted without warning. The narrow, winding trail he had been painstakingly tracing abruptly vanished beneath a devastating wall of crushed granite and splintered timber. A sudden rockfall, likely triggered by the sheer weight of the accumulating blizzard, had obliterated the entire mountain pass. Giant boulders rimed with jagged frost lay in chaotic, impassable piles across a 50-yard stretch. The fresh snow had already begun to smooth over the devastation, burying whatever evidence lay beneath the ruin. Alistair stopped. His chest heaved, the hot breath pluming from his jaws in thick white clouds, instantly snatched away by the gale. The delicate ribbon of scent he had been following ended exactly where the largest slab of stone had slammed into the frozen earth. Panic, cold, and terrifyingly sharp, spiked through his veins. This was not the calculated, manageable fear of a political misp in front of Hector Thorne. This was a primal, immediate terror that stripped away every ounce of his royal composure. He dropped heavily to his belly, shifting back into a man just enough to use his hands. His bare knuckles scraped violently against the freezing granite. The rough gravel bit into his palms like broken teeth, leaving smears of bright blood on the white powder. He ignored the stinging pain entirely, plunging his bare fingers into a tightly packed drift of fresh pine needles and pulverized ice pooled against the sheer rock face. He dug with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation, tearing through the frozen earth and splintered bark. He was desperately searching for something material. A torn scrap of a grey traveller's tunic, a single drop of blood, any concrete proof that the quiet healer had not been crushed instantly beneath the sudden collapse. The physical labour offered absolutely no comfort. The stone was unyielding, the ice packed solid by the sheer force of the wind. Alistair's hands grew entirely numb, the skin peeling back painfully from his fingernails as he clawed at the heavy rubble. He sifted through the debris blindly, turning over heavy stones, his breathing turning increasingly ragged in the thin mountain air. The bitter realization settled heavily over his broad shoulders, far colder than the storm itself. He had crafted what he believed to be a necessary lie to keep the Northern Lords pacified, treating his fated mate as a temporary pawn to shield her from their immediate wrath. Now that same strategic lie had driven her directly out into a brutal landscape that cared nothing for royal decrees, lineage registries, or sovereign titles. If she lay broken beneath this rockfall, no amount of political leverage would ever undo the damage he had set in motion. He forced himself to stop digging. He rested his bleeding forehead against the icy surface of a boulder, forcing his lungs to draw deep, measured breaths. He closed his eyes, deliberately centering his focus away from the chaotic visual noise of the avalanche. He tuned his heightened senses strictly to the microscopic air currents threading through the debris, meticulously filtering out the overwhelming smell of raw earth and the heavy metallic tang of his own blood. He waited in the freezing stillness. Finally, slipping through a narrow, jagged gap between two massive boulders on the far side of the slide, a secondary draft carried the faintest, ghostly echo of mint. It was weak, nearly destroyed by the altitude, but it was entirely untainted by the scent of copper or death. She had crossed the pass before the collapse occurred. A heavy shudder of relief racked his frame. Alistair pushed himself up from the bloody snow, his jaw set with grim determination, and immediately resumed the treacherous climb over the jagged rocks. Miles away, deep within the rising fury of the blizzard, Fiona maintained a steady, unhurried pace. The wind whipped at the edges of her grey wool coat, pulling at the heavy fabric, but she did not lean away from the gale. She simply adjusted her angle, letting the storm break against her shoulder rather than fighting it head-on. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against her ribs with every breath, but she did not allow herself to panic. Survival in the lowlands had taught her that fear burned calories faster than the cold itself. She kept her eyes fixed on the immediate ground ahead, scanning the shifting landscape with the calm, analytical precision of a healer reading a complex chart. She did not wander blindly. Her survival depended entirely on her practical knowledge of winter flora. She recognized the twisted, dark silhouettes of iron oak trees, their presence indicating a more stable root system and a lower likelihood of hidden ravines beneath the snow. She navigated by the subtle shifts in the bark of the ancient pines, noting that the moss always froze thickest on the windward side, providing her with a natural compass when the sun remained completely hidden by the dense grey cloud cover. The environment was harsh, but it was entirely predictable. It did not lie, and it did not perform for an audience of powerful men. Eventually the biting cold began to seep through the worn seams of her leather boots. The damp chill crept up her toes, a quiet physiological warning that required immediate attention before frostbite could take root. Fiona spotted a massive, fallen cedar tree, offering a small pocket of shelter beneath its sprawling, snow-laden roots. She carefully maneuvered her way into the hollow, the sudden drop in wind chill offering a brief, necessary respite from the relentless exposure. She sat on a dry patch of exposed earth, letting her breathing slow to a steady, regular rhythm. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, hardened lump of raw pine resin she had harvested hours earlier. Her knuckles were cracked and raw from the cold, the skin pulled tight over the bone, but her hands remained remarkably steady. She took a small piece of dry tinder from her pack, striking a flint just long enough to generate a brief spark to soften the resin. Once the amber substance grew pliable, she began to rub it methodically into the leaking seams of her boots. She pressed the sticky sap deep into the stitching, ensuring the leather was sealed tight against the melting snow. It was entirely unglamorous, solitary labor. There was no royal audience to witness her resilience, no sovereign to offer her a grand gesture of rescue. But as the resin hardened, forming a durable, waterproof seal over the worn leather, a profound sense of quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. She was a woman who knew exactly how to keep herself alive. She packed her flint away, tested the newly sealed seams with a brief touch, and stood back up. She stepped out of the shelter and turned her face back toward the deeper woods, moving steadily forward into the blinding white until a looming shape finally broke through the grey. The timber door of the abandoned watchkeeper's cabin had swelled with winter moisture, groaning against its stone frame as Fiona pushed it inward. The air inside held the sharp, undisturbed scent of dry rot, frozen dust, and decades of forgotten silence. The cabin was a relic of an older northern border patrol, its walls built from thick, unhewn limestone meant to withstand the biting winds of the Frostwood. She stepped across the threshold, letting the heavy door thud shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the blizzard outside. Her breath plumed in the stagnant air, a white ghost in the dim light filtering through the singular, frost-rimed window. She did not immediately rush toward the hearth in a desperate bid for heat. That was not how a lowland healer survived the cold. First, she assessed the perimeter of her sanctuary. The roof beams held firm. The floorboards, though groaning under her leather boots, were solid and dry. Only then did she turn her attention to the massive stone fireplace dominating the far wall. It was choked with the grey, petrified ash of fires burned out long before her arrival, scattered with fallen debris from the chimney. Kneeling on the freezing floorboards, she gathered a small handful of stiff, dry pine twigs from a forgotten pile in the corner. She bound them tightly together with a stray thread pulled from the hem of her worn wool traveller's tunic. With deliberate, meticulous strokes, Fiona used the makeshift brush to sweep the dust-laden hearth clean. She cleared away the dead ash, respecting the architecture of the space before demanding warmth from it. The rough stone and scattered rubble scraped against her knuckles. The gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth. She ignored the sting, focusing entirely on the physical geometry of survival. Once the flat stone was swept bare, she arranged her gathered kindling into a precise, breathable pyramid. Her fingers were stiff, the tips pale and numb from the grueling trek, but they did not shake. She struck her small flint against the iron striker. The first spark died on the damp wood. The second caught a piece of dried moss tucked into the center. She leaned in, shielding the fragile ember with her body, and blew a slow, steady stream of air until a thin ribbon of grey smoke curled upward. The fire took root. Slowly, the yellow flame crept up the twigs, casting long, wavering shadows across the cold room. Fiona sat back on her heels, watching the light reflect against the frost on her sleeve, and let the knowledge of her isolation settle into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. The heat radiated outward in meager waves, barely enough to thaw the hem of her cloak, but it was a victory of her own making. She had built this warmth with her own hands, relying on no royal provision and no courtly favor. She unlaced her stiff boots, setting them at a calculated distance from the flames to dry without scorching the leather. Every movement was measured. Every breath was an exercise in retaining control. The draft in the room shifted violently, long before the sound of heavy footsteps reached the cabin. The small flame in the hearth guttered, leaning away from the entrance as a sudden rush of freezing outside air defeated the swollen timber of the door. The door wrenched open. Alistair stood in the threshold, completely stripped of the polished, calculating sovereignty that had commanded the great hall the night before. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with melting snow and sweat. His heavy coat was torn at the shoulder, soaked entirely through with the freezing precipitation of the forest. He breathed in ragged, shallow gasps, his broad chest heaving as his eyes frantically scanned the dim interior of the watchkeeper's cabin. The scent of ozone, wet pine, and exhausted wolf filled the small room, overpowering the delicate smoke of Fiona's fire. When his frantic gaze finally landed on her, sitting quietly by the hearth, the sheer relief that washed over his harsh features was entirely unmasked. He took a heavy, unsteady step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He closed the distance between them with the desperate urgency of a freezing man finding a sudden source of heat. Dropping to his knees beside the hearth, his large hand reached out reflexively to grasp her frost-bitten sleeve, seeking to pull her into the protective warmth of his chest. Fiona did not flinch. She simply stood up and stepped backward. Her movement was smooth, utterly devoid of the dramatic panic he might have anticipated. With her right hand, she reached down and picked up the heavy iron hearth poker resting beside the kindling. She did not raise it as a weapon. Instead, she lowered the blackened iron tip to the floorboards, placing the long metal shaft precisely between the toe of his boot and the hem of her worn tunic. The physical boundary was drawn, absolute and undeniable. Alistair froze, his outstretched hand suspended over the cold iron divider. The firelight flickered against the harsh planes of his face, illuminating the sudden, devastating comprehension dawning in his dark eyes. He looked from the poker to her calm, unreadable expression. Fiona held his gaze with the stillness of a compass needle finding north. She required no royal guard to protect her space, and she would accept no unearned physical comfort from a man who had traded her dignity for a political advantage. The silence stretched between them, heavier than the blizzard outside, swallowing the desperate apologies he had brought with him. Alistair slowly pulled his hand back, leaning his heavy frame against the uneven door frame. His dark hair was crusted with melting ice from his desperate run through the storm. Drops of freezing water slid down the hardened leather of his armor, pooling on the rotting floorboards beneath his boots. He did not immediately try to breach the line again. Instead, He occupied the small space with a calculated stillness, his breathing slowing to match the harsh rhythm of the wind. When he spoke, his voice was not the commanding roar of an alpha king, nor the pleading whisper of a guilty man. It was the precise, measured tone of a sovereign breaking down a war strategy. Thorn did not come to offer fealty. He came to install his niece at my side, and he brought a specific contingency plan if that negotiation failed. Fiona sat on a weathered crate near the small fire, the amber light catching the sharp edges of the iron tongs resting by the coals. She did not interrupt. She simply watched the way his broad shoulders rose and fell under his damp tunic, waiting for the logic that had allowed him to reduce their profound bond to a court jester's passing punchline. I saw the glass vial in Thorn's inner coat when he leaned over the banquet table. Alistair continued, his jaw tightening. Distilled snow adder venom. It is untraceable in wine, entirely scentless to a wolf, and fatal within 3 minutes. Hector is a conservative purist. He views lowland blood as an infection upon the royal lineage. If he understood what you actually meant to me, if he realized you carried the silver mark, he would not have argued treaties. He would have simply had you poisoned before the second course was served. Alistair pushed himself off the doorframe, taking a half-step closer to the hearth, though he remained strictly on his side of the room, acutely aware of the boundaries she had drawn. The floorboards groaned in protest. I had 3 seconds to calculate a defense, he explained, searching desperately for a shift in her composed expression. If I claimed you publicly, I painted a target on your back that I could not watch not 24 hours a day. By dismissing you, by laughing with them, by calling you a temporary distraction, I removed your threat level entirely. I made you invisible to Thorn's political matrix. I needed exactly 3 weeks to secure alternate grain routes and strip his military authority. I thought I was buying us time. His reasoning was mathematically flawless. It was the exact kind of ruthless statesmanship that made him a formidable ruler. He had traded her public dignity for her physical survival, balancing the cold ledger of her life against the arrogance of the northern lords. Fiona reached into the deep pocket of her pack and withdrew a spool of waxed linen thread and a curved bone needle. A pine branch had torn a wide gash in the hem of her woolen traveller's cloak during her trek through the freezing snow. She spread the heavy fabric across her lap, her movements unhurried and deliberately mundane. She did not throw the logic back at him. She did not scream that she would rather face poison than be insulted in front of sneering elites. She simply held the bone needle up to the flickering light, narrowed her eyes slightly, and guided the thick thread through the tiny eyelet with perfect precision. "I understand the mechanics of your choice," Fiona said quietly, her eyes remaining fixed on the torn wool. She pressed the needle into the tough fabric, pushing it through with steady pressure. "You played a tactical game. You neutralized an immediate threat using the most efficient tool available, my reputation." The rough sound of the thread pulling through the heavy wool filled the tense silence. Her hand did not shake. Her knuckles were pale from the lingering cold, but her grip was absolute. "But you fundamentally misunderstood what a mate is supposed to be," she continued, her voice remaining as even as a frozen lake. "You looked at Hector and saw an assassin. You looked at me and saw a vulnerability that needed to be hidden away. You did not trust me enough to warn me. You did not think I possessed the discipline to sit quietly while Thorn plotted, or the intelligence to avoid drinking from a poisoned cup." Alistair remained perfectly still, the raw cold of the room seeming to settle deeper into his bones. He had expected her to be furious. He had anticipated tears, perhaps a demand for an immediate apology. He had not anticipated this surgical dismantling of his protective instinct. "I am a healer, Alistair," Fiona said, making another precise stitch. "I know what snow adder venom smells like. I know the metallic taste of nightshade. I have survived in the impoverished lowlands by paying attention to the very things powerful men ignore. I could have stood beside you. We could have outmaneuvered Thorn together, as equals. She tied off the thread, snipping the excess with a small pair of iron shears. Only then did she look up, meeting his desperate gaze with an unwavering stare. Instead, you chose to shield me by turning me into a joke, she told him, letting the heavy cloak settle over her knees. Not because it was the only way, but because it was the easiest way for you to maintain absolute control. Protection that requires my public humiliation is not safety. It is ownership, and I am not a possession you can discard in public and retrieve in private. The silence that followed was not the kind that falls between words. It was the kind that swallows them whole. Alistair's political defense crumbled into ash, not under the weight of an emotional outburst, but against the undeniable truth of her self-respect. Alistair leaned forward, his massive frame dwarfing the fragile wooden chair he had claimed. The wind howled against the thin, rotting walls of the abandoned watchkeeper's cabin, rattling the loose floorboards and sending a draft of freezing air across their boots. He asked her how to fix it. He asked for a path back, his voice dropping to a raw, unvarnished register that held no trace of the sovereign who had held court the night before. He spoke of the long hours, tracking her scent through the Frostwood, of the physical sickness of finding only empty snowdrifts where she should have been. He offered sweeping promises of protection, of absolute loyalty, of a future where no northern lord would ever dare speak against her presence in the keep. Fiona listened. She did not interrupt his pleading, nor did she let her rigid posture soften. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly over her worn woolen lap. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the quiet, analytical calculation in her eyes. When his words finally ran out, leaving a heavy, expectant silence in the drafty room, she gave her answer. "Words spoken in a lonely cabin have a habit of evaporating," Fiona said. Her tone was steady, devoid of any sharp edge, but entirely lacking any comforting warmth. "You sit here now, cold and shivering, and you make sweeping vows. But those vows will freeze and shatter the moment we cross the threshold of Vaughan Fortress." Alistair flinched. The absolute certainty in her voice struck harder than any physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to swear his word remained intact, but she raised a single, cold finger to stop him. "You traded my standing for political security," Fiona continued, her gaze locked on the dying embers rather than his face. "You used your royal authority to mock me, and the court witnessed it. A private explanation does not erase a public humiliation. The court is a machine built on leverage and precedent. Your nobles do not respect whispered regrets. They respect ink, seals, and law. If I return with you simply because you asked politely in the woods, I return as a conquered pet. I return as exactly what Hector Thorn called me, a temporary distraction who knows her place." She adjusted the collar of her tunic, her movements precise and unhurried. "I will not survive on the charity of your regrets. If I am to step foot inside your keep again, it will not be under your protection. It will be under my own authority. I require a formal, written guarantee of my sovereignty, a binding treaty that legally divorces my rights from your royal favor." The demand settled between them, heavier than the snow accumulating on the sagging roof. Fiona was not asking for a romantic gesture or a biological claiming. She was demanding a structural vow, a legal document that would force the Alpha King to permanently yield a portion of his absolute power to a lowland healer. Alistair stared at her, the rushing sound of the blizzard outside momentarily muted by the sheer weight of her demand. The request was completely unprecedented in the history of the Northern Pax. Kings did not share sovereignty, nor did they sign binding legal treaties with their mates. A fated bond was supposed to be biological, expected to enforce its own natural hierarchy without the need for parchment. Yet, as he looked at the woman sitting calmly across from him, entirely self-possessed in the freezing wilderness, he realized the biology meant nothing without the structural respect she demanded. The silence stretched, thick and assessing. The small fire in the hearth cracked, a sudden pop of burning pine sap that briefly illuminated the deep, hollow lines bracketing his mouth. He understood the trap he had built for himself. He had played the ruthless, untouchable monarch in the great hall to shield her, and in doing so, he had proven that his royal word was a weapon that could be turned against her at any moment. She was absolutely right to demand armor that did not depend on his changing strategies. A written decree of sovereignty, Alistair repeated slowly, testing the shape of the phrase on his tongue. His tone did not elevate. Instead, a profound clarity seemed to wash over him, stripping away the chaotic urgency of the morning's chase. Earning her back meant tearing down the very foundation of his unchecked authority. He did not argue. He did not try to negotiate the terms or remind her of his status as the ruler of the Frostwood. Instead, the man who commanded the northern armies stood up from his chair. He moved with slow, deliberate care, closing the distance between them, not to crowd her space, but to bypass her entirely. Alistair knelt on the dusty, uneven floorboards beside the small stone hearth. His dark boots and heavy trousers were still soaked from the storm, but he ignored the damp chill. He reached for a rough piece of split cedar from the pile she had gathered earlier, placing it carefully onto the fading embers. He blew gently on the coals, watching the orange glow spread and catch the dry bark. The smoke carried the sharp, clean scent of resin into the small room. "I will give you the treaty," he said. His voice was remarkably quiet, his eyes still fixed on the growing flames rather than demanding her attention. He remained on his knees, tending the fire with the focused, unhurried diligence of a common servant. "I will draft the document myself. You will dictate the terms, and I will sign them before we leave this forest." Fiona watched the broad span of his shoulders as he worked the bellows. The most powerful man in the Northern Territories was currently feeding her fire, fully accepting his role as the petitioner in her temporary sanctuary. He was not ordering her home. He was yielding to her boundaries, recognizing that his crown offered no leverage in this small, drafty room. The warmth from the hearth finally began to push back the freezing chill of the blizzard outside. The rhythmic thud of a loose wooden shutter against the cabin's outer wall measured the heavy silence between them. Alistair moved, with a deliberate, unhurried precision. He did not crowd the narrow space near the hearth. Instead, he stepped toward the scarred timber table in the center of the room, clearing away a scattering of dried pine needles and ash with the side of his hand. From the inner breast pocket of his heavy winter coat, he withdrew a folded sheet of blank vellum. The thick parchment lay flat against the rough wood, stark and white against the dim, soot-stained interior of the watchkeeper's refuge. This was the foundation of the sovereignty decree. Fiona watched his hands from her place by the fire. They were perfectly steady. He uncorked a small travel vial of black iron gall ink, pouring a shallow measure into a chipped clay saucer resting near her mending kit. The northern laws required blood to bind a royal vow, an ancient stipulation meant to prove the physical cost of a sovereign's word. Alistair did not draw the ceremonial dagger strapped to his belt. He did not rely on the heavy iron weapons of the court to make his point. Instead, his gaze dropped to the spool of coarse thread and the silver sewing needle Fiona had used to mend her woolen hem. He reached out, his hand hovering over the needle, offering her the silent choice to deny him its use. She gave a single, shallow nod. Alistair picked up the delicate tool. The contrast of the tiny silver sliver between his scarred, heavy knuckles was absolute. He pressed the sharp tip into the pad of his left index finger. He did not flinch or hesitate. A single dark bead of blood swelled from the puncture, heavy and bright in the amber firelight. He squeezed the drop into the clay saucer, watching the thick red ribbon curl into the black ink. He used the blunt end of his quill to blend them together. The metallic scent of copper briefly cut through the heavy wood smoke of the cabin, sharp and undeniable. When the ink was ready, he bent over the table. The scratching of the quill filled the room. He wrote the sovereignty decree in absolute silence, laying out the terms of her autonomy in tight, precise script. Every stroke of the feather was a concession of royal power, transferred directly into the fibre of the document. Alistair carried the silence of the room, without the nervous impulse to fill it with meaningless justification. He catalogued her rights with the same meticulous attention to detail that he usually reserved for military treaties. Fiona remained seated by the hearth, the warmth of the fire pressing against her shoulder, anchoring her in the present reality. She did not interrupt the quiet rhythm of his labour. She let the scratching quill serve as the only apology she was willing to accept. This was not a promise whispered in the dark, but a structural surrender forged in the bitter cold. The ink settled into the vellum, legally binding the Alpha King to the quiet healer he had publicly discarded. Alistair finished the final line, setting the quill down beside the clay saucer. He took a slow step back, leaving the document squarely in the center of the table. He did not push it toward her, nor did he ask her to approach. He simply withdrew, giving her the physical space to examine the surrender on her own terms. Fiona rose from the hearth. The floorboards creaked under her worn boots as she walked to the table. The parchment was heavy, the blood ink still shining wet in the uneven light of the fire. She did not glance at his face to gauge his sincerity. She looked only at the words. She read every single line, treating the royal decree with the same critical eye she applied to a fever chart. The decree was extensive. It granted her absolute immunity from the Northern Lord's judgment, guaranteed her financial independence from the royal treasury, and established her standing as a sovereign entity entirely outside the standard hierarchy of the pack. But it was not complete. Fiona picked up the quill. The metal nib was still faintly warm from his grip. She dipped it back into the copper-scented ink. Moving to the margin of the heavy parchment, she aligned the tip with the bottom section of the text. "The Northern Dukes control the grain, but they do not control the sick," Fiona said, her voice quiet and distinctly even. She began to write. Her handwriting was practical and unornamented, born of years spent maintaining medical ledgers and herbal inventories. She added explicit, uncompromising clauses protecting the lowland healers. She wrote that no royal tax could be levied against the infirmaries, and no healer could be conscripted by Hector Thorne or his conservative allies without her direct written consent. She was securing her people. She was building a fortress out of ink and law. Alistair watched the side of her face as she worked. He did not object to a single addition. He merely observed the quiet, systematic expansion of her power, accepting the structural changes to his kingdom without a single breath of protest. When the clauses were finished, Fiona moved to the bottom of the page. She signed her name, Fiona Mercer. She did not append any royal titles to the signature. She did not write Luna, and she did not write Mate. She simply wrote the name she had carried into the freezing Frostwood, ensuring it sat perfectly level with his heavy royal crest. The ink pooled slightly at the sharp curve of the final letter. Fiona lifted the heavy parchment from the table, holding it carefully by the dry edges. She pursed her lips and a slow, steady stream of cool air across the wet script. The mundane, deeply human act of blow-drying the blood ink stripped the document of its intimidating royal aura, grounding it firmly in her practical reality. The dark red sheen slowly matured into a flat, permanent rust. The sovereignty decree was bound. The suffocating tension in the cabin shifted, no longer a void of betrayal, but the quiet architecture of a newly leveled ground. The dawn broke over the Frostwood not with warmth, but with a sharp, crystalline clarity. The blizzard had exhausted itself during the night, leaving the ancient pines heavily laden with undisturbed snow. Inside the watchkeeper's cabin, the small fire had burned down to white ash. Fiona adjusted the leather strap of her satchel over her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of her herbal bundles and the worn wool of her traveller's tunic packed securely inside. Alistair stood by the door, his dark cloak brushing the frost-covered floorboards. He watched her methodical movements, the quiet efficiency that had always defined her. As she moved to step past him, he extended a hand toward her satchel. The gesture was instinctual, a reflex of his royal upbringing, and perhaps a lingering trace of the mate bond's protective urge. "The snow is deep," Alistair said, his voice low and raspy from the cold. "Let me carry the weight." Fiona paused, looking at his outstretched hand. She did not flinch away from him, nor did she raise her voice. She simply held the strap of her pack with a steady, unyielding grip. "A sovereign carries her own weight," Fiona answered. The words were not an accusation, but a calm statement of fact. She stepped through the doorway and into the freezing morning air. Alistair did not argue. He let his hand drop to his side, accepting the boundary she had drawn. That was the new reality of their arrangement. The sovereignty decree folded carefully inside his breast pocket was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was a structural shift in how they would exist together. He followed her out into the snow, and when they began the long descent toward the valley, he did not walk ahead to break the trail, nor did he walk behind to guard her back. He walked exactly beside her. The journey down the mountain was slow, measured by the crunch of heavy boots breaking through the icy crust. They moved in an unbroken quiet, a shared understanding that required no nervous chatter to fill the spaces between them. They left 2 parallel tracks in the pristine snow, distinct and equal. By the time the dark, imposing spires of Vaughan Fortress came into view, the sun was fully above the horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the frozen moors. As they approached the outer battlements, the sleepy stable guard, Brannock Kelly, stood huddled by the heavy iron gates. He blinked through the biting wind, his tired eyes widening as he registered the approaching figures. Brannock had seen many women brought back to the keep by powerful men, usually carried, exhausted, or trailing reluctantly behind in the shadow of a conqueror. But Fiona Mercer did not walk in Alistair's shadow. She kept pace with the Alpha King, her chin level, her worn wool tunic contrasting sharply with his velvet and fur. She looked neither humbled nor saved. As they passed through the towering iron gates, the guards instinctively straightened their posture, sensing a shift in the hierarchy that required no formal announcement. Fiona had left the fortress in the dark as an overlooked healer. She returned in the light as a recognized power. The heavy oak doors of the great hall were closed when they arrived at the inner keep, but the murmur of aristocratic voices bled through the thick wood. The morning council had already gathered. Alistair did not pause to change his snow-dampened clothes, and Fiona did not ask for a moment to fix her wind-tousled hair. They entered the hall exactly as they were. When the massive doors swung open, the murmuring ceased instantly. The great hall was a cavern of cold stone, high-vaulted ceilings, and long tables dominated by the northern lords. At the center of the gathering stood Hector Thorne, his posture arrogant, his heavy winter cloak draped over his broad shoulders. He had clearly been in the middle of a speech, likely solidifying his control over the winter grain supply while the king was absent. Hector's gaze flicked from Alistair to Fiona, his upper lip curling in a faint, unmistakable sneer. "Your Majesty," Hector drawled, his voice echoing off the frozen walls. "We delayed the council. Assuming you were attending to urgent border matters, I see instead you have been retrieving your lowland distraction." Fiona felt the sudden, crushing weight of the room's attention, the same suffocating pressure that had driven her out the night before, but this time she did not retreat into invisibility. She stood perfectly still, her breath steady, letting the insult hang in the freezing air until its crudeness became obvious to everyone present. Alistair did not growl. He did not lunge across the table or bare his teeth in a display of brute territorial dominance. Alistair occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He allowed Hector's arrogance to echo until it felt entirely hollow. Slowly, Deliberately, the king walked to the head of the high table. Fiona walked beside him, stopping only when he stopped. Reaching into his coat, Alistair withdrew the rolled parchment. He smoothed it flat against the cold oak surface. The dark ink, mixed with the undeniable rusted copper hue of his own blood, caught the morning light filtering through the high windows. "There are no distractions in my court." "Duke Thorn," Alistair said, his voice entirely devoid of the mocking warmth it had carried the previous night. "There is only the law, and the law has been updated." Hector stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the text upside down. "A piece of parchment does not alter low blood, Alistair. The North respects strength, not scribbled promises to a healer." Alistair placed his bare hand flat over the center of the document. "This is a sovereignty decree," he stated, the absolute certainty in his tone causing several lesser lords to shift uncomfortably. "Drafted in blood, bound by the ancient pack statutes of the Frostwood. It grants Fiona Mercer absolute legal autonomy, equal standing in this council, and immunity from northern jurisdictional disputes." Hector's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the procedural reality of the document sank in. He had built his political leverage on the assumption that Fiona was merely a temporary, unprotected mate who could be bullied or discarded. But a blood-signed decree was constitutional law. To dispute it was not merely to insult a lowland woman. It was an act of formal treason against the Crown's highest registry. "You yield royal authority to a wolfless girl," Hector demanded, his voice losing its smooth veneer, cracking under the pressure of sudden, undeniable defeat. "I yield nothing," Alistair answered quietly, turning his gaze toward Fiona with a look of profound, measured respect. "I am merely recording the truth that already existed." Fiona looked at the legal text, then at the assembled lords. The documented proof of her autonomy was absolute, pressed into the parchment with a finality that brute force could never achieve. She did not need to scream or demand their submission. The ledgers of the court had been corrected, and her dignity was no longer subject to their approval. The great hall's heavy oak doors remained sealed against the winter wind, trapping the profound silence that had settled over the northern lords. Hector Thorn stared at the parchment, his arrogant posture dissolving as the full weight of the legal terms crushed his carefully built conspiracy. The sovereignty decree did not merely elevate a lowland healer, it systematically stripped the northern dukes of their unchecked control over the kingdom's grain reserves. Every clause Fiona had added dismantled the economic leverage the Duke had used to hold the crown hostage. The ruined man opened his mouth to protest, to demand a trial by blood or a council vote, but the undeniable signatures of both the Alpha King and his sovereign equal rendered any objection treason. Alistair Craig did not raise his voice. He stood beside the high table, projecting a cold, quiet authority that left no room for debate. The king gave a subtle nod toward the periphery of the hall, where the lower-ranking guards had been summoned to witness the structural shift in power. Brannock Kelly stepped forward from the shadows of the stone pillars. The tired stable guard, a man who had spent decades freezing on the late-night watches while the elites plotted by warm hearths, walked with a steady, unhurried cadence. The sheer indignity of being handled by a common watchman made Hector's face flush with dark, humiliated fury, but he dared not move. Brannock stopped in front of the disgraced duke. With calloused, practical hands, the sentry reached up and unclasped the heavy gold council medallion from the nobleman's velvet collar. The metallic clink of the chain falling away echoed sharply in the quiet room. It was a precise, administrative execution of justice, devoid of the chaotic violence the northern pack usually favored. Alistair watched the medallion drop into the guard's palm, then shifted his gaze back to the ruined lord. His command was low, carrying the undeniable weight of the new law, requiring the former councillor to acknowledge the authority he had mocked only a day before. Hector's jaw tightened until the bone seemed ready to snap. The physical pressure of the sovereign's gaze and the binding legal reality of the treaty forced his rigid shoulders downward. Slowly, with grinding reluctance, the proud northerner bent his knees against the freezing stone floor. He lowered his head, forced to bow deeply and formally to the woman he had dismissed as a temporary distraction. The rest of the court watched in absolute stillness, the political hierarchy of Vaughan Fortress breaking and remaking itself in the span of a single morning. Brannock stepped back to his post, the gold chain wrapped securely around his worn leather glove, while the banished lord remained kneeling in the cold dust of his shattered ambition. The fire in the hearth of the new sovereign chambers burned with a steady, resinous crackle, filling the stone room with the comforting scent of pine and dried lavender. It was a stark contrast to the bitter blizzard still raging outside the fortress walls. The heavy linen curtains were drawn tight against the frost, securing a pocket of unshakable warmth. Fiona Mercer sat at the edge of a large, polished oak desk, her fingers resting lightly against a porcelain teacup. The frantic survival arithmetic that had defined her previous nights, counting provisions, measuring escape routes, hardening herself against insult, had finally quieted. The space belonged to her, legally and undeniably, etched into the very foundations of the Pax registry. Across the small table, Alistair sat in a high-backed leather chair, a cup of dark herbal tea resting untouched near his hand. He did not crowd her space or demand her attention. The king occupied the room with the measured patience of a man who understood that his presence here was a privilege, not a biological right. The quiet intimacy between them was no longer built on the shaky ground of a hidden bond or political convenience, but on the solid foundation of transparent respect. He watched her with a steady, grounding focus, offering the kind of safety that came from a power deliberately held in check. Resting near the center of the desk, completely unwrinkled, lay the ancestral silver mate ribbon. It was the souspice of embroidered silk she had abandoned in his study hours before dawn, back when she believed she was nothing more than a disposable secret. Now the object carried a completely different weight. It was no longer a cage of expectation or a chain of obligation to a man who would hide her. Fiona set her teacup down, the ceramic making a soft, domestic sound against the wood. She reached out and picked up the length of silver thread, letting the smooth fabric slide over her knuckles. Alistair did not move, though a subtle shift in his breath revealed his intense observation. He waited, giving her absolute freedom to leave the ribbon on the table, to burn it, or to lock it away. Instead, the healer raised her hands and gathered her dark hair at the nape of her neck. With deliberate, unhurried motions, she wound the silk around the heavy strands, tying a loose, secure knot by her own design. She did not look to the sovereign for approval or permission. By binding her own hair, she claimed the connection on her own terms, turning a symbol of biological destiny into a daily, voluntary choice. The warmth of the hearth settled over them, deep and durable, as the silent king finally picked up his tea, content to sit beside the woman who owed him nothing and had chosen him anyway.